Thank you very much, Yvonne, and good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back in Donegal. I was up here at another conference about a year ago, and I am always struck, and I don't say this in any sort of silly, flattering way, but I'm always struck by the absolutely extraordinary quality of the hospitality here. Now, and I've spoken at McGill before, now the theme this evening that we're supposed to address is where are we, what is happening to us and where are we going? Now you have to be very brave or very foolish to attempt an existential theme of that scope, and you have to be downright mad to do it in the time limit that our esteemed Joe has given us. I was honoured to be asked the keynote address, but I was saying to him earlier, he's the only person I know who has what I call a kind of a speed dating version of the keynote address. So I'm not going to. I timed myself today, and it was exactly double the amount of time. So I'm really just going to hit a couple of main points. Now, I'm starting really with, I suppose, a central observation, and that is that even though we all live in one state in Ireland, in the state of Ireland, that we live in two very different psychological states. As individuals, we live in a private universe of optimism. As citizens, we're increasingly inhabiting a political universe of distrust. All of you know, now the reason I chose that as my theme is because a certain amount of scepticism about politics is to be expected, and indeed very wise. So we expect that. But I think when scepticism shades into cynical distrust, then I think that's a troubling phenomenon. So just let me give you some of the figures to support my view that there are two universes here. You'll all now be completely drearily familiar with the succession of opinion polls that show what we think about the way we're being governed. Take the Sunday Independent poll recently, where 75% of people said that they were dissatisfied with government. Dissatisfaction with party leaders ranged from, moderately dissatisfied to extremely dissatisfied, and over a third of the electorate now do not know who they would vote for if there were election tomorrow. Last year, the Irish Times, at the end of 2012, asked people in Ireland about who they trust. And Irish politicians came bottom of the pile. 17% said they trusted Irish politicians. That's even lower than the 25% who say they trusted European politicians. And government ministers did little better at 18%. Contrast that with the people that really have our high trust in Ireland. The ordinary man and woman in the street, 82% of us trust each other. The Gardaí, 80%, I'm glad to say, trust the Gardaí, and doctors enjoy a rating of 90%. Now, astonishingly, side by side with that very dystopian view of the political realm is a private universe of seemingly unquenchable optimism and positivity. And I'll give you the one that the example I think that really stands out in my mind. Cast your mind back to 2006, when the Celtic tiger was rampant. We had the second highest per capita GDP in the world, and half the world was beating a path to our door to find out how we were doing it. And during that year, the Gallup organisation, as part of their regular yearly global survey of well-being, asked Irish people about their lives. Now, the question that you're actually asked is, imagine that there is a ladder with 10 steps. And number 10, top rung, is the best possible life for you. And then they were asked, and the bottom one was the worst possible life for you. And they were asked, on which rung would you rank your life now? And Irish people ranked their lives currently at 7, which is pretty high. And then they were asked how they would rank their estimation of their future. And they ranked it at 8. 5 years from now, they thought they'd be at an 8. Now, fast forward to 2010. 2010 was when the whole thing came crashing down around us. The government was in deep trouble. We knew then exactly the scale of the economic collapse we were facing. And in that morning after optimism, the Gallup organisation galloped into town again and asked us the same question. Now, astonishingly, absolutely astonishingly, at that time the results were actually very little in the way of difference. We still, now there has been a slight drop, but we still were ranked in the top, we're well into the top 10 countries globally in terms of our level of optimism. Only 4% of people were in what Gallup called the suffering category. The majority were in the thriving category that I just described. Now, compare that, and I haven't got the time to show you the figures, but it's actually very interesting. Compare that to our fellow bailed out or pre-bailed out countries, where the figures would match exactly what you would think. We were even higher in 2006 than the UK, the US, and even Germany. The absolute economic engine of the EU. And where far fewer people were thriving and many more were suffering. After 3 years of recession, 2012, the Gallup poll shows that we've actually improved our position again. And this pattern of resilience and positivity is consistently borne out by other studies. And I'm not going to go into them now. Now, how can we explain that disparity? Because you would expect that in the context of that kind of unquestionable optimism, that this would, as it were, be reflected in a very high level of esteem in our governance, and of course, far from it. Now, let me say at this point that, we expect some distinction for the reasons I gave earlier. But this level of distinction and disparity is, I think, a matter of concern, because what it seems to be saying is that we're thriving and flourishing in spite of, rather than because of, the way we're governed, or at least that's our perception. And there's not much difference in terms of impact between our perception of things and reality. The reason that that's a matter of concern is because trust actually counts. Trust is at the heart of all well-functioning entities, personal relationships, organisations and whole societies. The work of Robert Putnam in Harvard shows that trust is actually at the heart of a functioning democracy, and it most certainly has to be at the heart of a republic. Because the social contract, the taxes we pay, the laws we obey, we do that on the basis that it is in the common good and that we will benefit. Without that feeling of trust in those we govern, there's no true solidarity and there's no true reciprocity. So how can we explain that disparity? Well, I start with what I think is the wrong answer, and that's that deep dissatisfaction in politics is routinely dismissed by politicians as being some class of midterm blues or the newly discovered social disorder of austerity fatigue. And while that may be a factor, I think it is far from the whole story. So let me look maybe at what is going on. And I think at least one reason is that the government has squandered a large part of that most precious resource that was placed on them in the last election, which is our trust, because they promised us a new kind of politics, and we believed them. Now, I have to say at this point something about the psychology of trust. And that is trust, whether in personal relationships or institutions or politics, is intimately bound up with feelings of risk and vulnerability. When we put our trust in people, when we give them power over us, it makes us feel vulnerable. And when that trust is breached, as it was so egregiously by the last government, then we are in a very vulnerable state indeed. And when we put our trust in another government, we are in quite a distinct psychological state. Anyone who's ever been let down, and that will include everybody in this room at some point, either by a person or an organisation, will know that you approach them afterwards with a very definite frame of mind. And that frame of mind is hypervigilance. You're on the lookout for any sign of being let down again. You adopt a very, very high standard of expectation because you don't want to be screwed up again. And even though you will register when good things happen, it won't necessarily make you feel more trusting. And that's the mistake the government are making. They are doing very good things, but they somehow think that's going to translate into trust. It doesn't, because what we do is we set even higher standards because we think, okay, but we're going to wait and see. And in that very unstable psychological environment, any act, and I ask you just to reflect on your own experiences of being let down by anyone, any act of perceived self-interest or cronyism, any show of arrogance, any show of being out of touch is fatal, and the reaction is swift and damning. And that is why seemingly small issues, like politicians' pay, expenses, their use of patronage to put people, that supporters, into high positions, and so on, is so salient. It is not for substantive reasons, but because they carry a lot of symbolic weight. And that the human brain is engineered to pay more attention and put more weight on the negative than it does on the positive, and any sign of betrayal of trust is assigned a very great weight indeed. But here is the critical point. In that situation, when the electorate has had such a recent experience of betrayal, it is not enough for the next government or politicians as a class, just to be reasonable. They are expected to do more than is required, or indeed on occasion even more than is reasonable. That's the expectation that we have, and we can't help it. That's the way your brain works. We want to see if they are going to make themselves vulnerable. And if they don't, then we don't trust them. It is the essence of rebuilding trust to make yourself vulnerable to the people that have been let down. Nelson Mandela understood that. His reaction when he came out of prison was not to be reasonable and do reasonable things. He did completely unreasonable things in terms of the way he reached out. Of course, that is why we regard him as such an incredible statesman. There's also, I think, and I can't go into it here, the lack of will for political reform of the system. It is really quite extraordinary to me that the way we do politics here is still stuck in the most rigid, dysfunctional hierarchy with a set of procedures and protocols that are really quite medieval and really have no transparency a lot of the time and very little logic. It actually is only rivaled by the Vatican. And I actually think that it's no coincidence that the Vatican and the hierarchy with a capital H are enjoying, as it were, the same assault in terms of trust in them as politicians. And I made a point today, and I'll come back to it, I hope, in the questions and answers, about the lack of psychological investment in the kind of issues, in the kind of emotional intelligence that we need to have to understand the other more cognitive, social, elite reasons why things went pear-shaped to the extent they did, and not just the externals. But I'll come back to that later. So I think the result is that we are in danger of developing what psychologists call collective learned helplessness. Now, learned helplessness, I wish I had time to tell you about the experiment, because it is one of the classic experiments in psychology. But essentially, it is an experiment which showed that you can condition animals and you can condition human beings to become so helpless when you subject them to shocks that they have no control over, that when you actually give them a route of escape, they actually can't take it anymore. They just feel so helpless. And anyone who's interested, I'll explain it later. Learned helplessness in a political context is a highly dangerous state, because it can induce a despondent and angry kind of plague on all their houses kind of attitude. And that, together then with an overly sort of negative attack on politicians, because it leads to that sort of kind of predatory attack almost, can lead to extremes of populism. And we've witnessed, for example, the debacle in Italy, where a comedian who has rather extreme anarchist views was elected, and at last time I looked, held the balance of power, and apparently issues edicts, political edicts through his blog. The chaos that has ensued is easily explained. And we're not immune to that kind of, I suppose, disrespect for systems ourselves. I mean, remember, we once sent Dustin the turkey to Europe, So where should we be going? Well, I'll just say very briefly, we should start with the positive. We should start by listing some of the extraordinary achievements we have made as a republic. We have become more open, more tolerant, more generous than we were before. And I think we've done that in a very Irish way, not through sort of articulation of very high principles, but through kind of hard cases. As we looked at the way we were dealing with young women who found themselves pregnant and people who found themselves in loveless marriages, and more than anything, the treatment of children in institutions, I think whatever our private views about such matters, I think we made radical changes to find responses that were appropriate. I think we did it well. And we did it through, even though I know we all got very tired of the cultural wars, even recently, that were waged. But in fact, they're a very healthy sign of a democracy, that we can argue in public our views. And bit by bit, even though it looks like we're going around in circles, bit by bit, the confusions are cleared up, and we find some kind of negotiated settlement. That is a sign of a well-functioning democracy. And even though there isn't full consensus or universal agreement, I think there is that negotiated settlement. We've never done that, though, about the principles, the more political principles that should underline a republic. We haven't done the same debate. And I think we need to bridge that divide between private optimism and positivity and the growing cynicism that we have about political engagement. I often think about Seamus Heaney's wonderful quote when he observed how cowardice in the soul issues in corruption in the state. And of course, when you think about the catastrophic mistakes that were made by politicians and bankers and regulators, you think that sort of just about covers it. Cowardice in the soul issues in corruption in the state. But we also need to recall the second part of Heaney's quote, which is how failure of nerve in the bystander is ultimately responsible for callousness in the culture. And in a republic, there can't be any bystanders. Despite our disappointment and disillusion and sometimes even despair about politics, we have to struggle against that view of politics as some kind of fallen state. We can't allow a feeling of learned helplessness to sunder us from our sense of citizenship and our duties as a citizen, and most particularly from our sense of our best self. It is very tempting to retreat into the private sphere and to think, okay, I'm optimistic about myself and my own family and my own community, and let the country go to hell in a handbasket for all I care. But it does actually matter that we are now doing that, or in danger of doing it, because it will essentially privatise optimism. It'll turn us into gated communities, as it were. And we won't have the energy, we won't lend the energy of our ideas and our commitment to building up, to the civic energy that is required to build a republic that we deserve. Optimism actually counts. Optimism isn't some silly, touchy-feely accessory. It actually really counts. We have fantastic evidence that the two things which make countries sustainably economically successful are, one, openness to new ideas and technology, and my God, do we do that well here, and two, a country's optimism. And we know that optimism is the only antidote to a kind of cynical hostility, which I think can become a cancer in a society. So we have to lend that energy. We have to cross that divide. And we have to build, I think, give our energies to a kind of real civic and political renewal. And if we don't do that, we're only going to have a second-best republic. I think we deserve more. I think we're capable of more. Now, we may not have, there may be no grandeur or perfection in our results. Politics is a fairly brutal game. But as in any other realm in life, it is the effort to make sense of failures and setbacks, the effort to keep maintaining a glimpse of the world as potentially perfect, and to keep the two together in our minds, that really, in a coherent whole, that makes for a true republic, and indeed is what makes us human. So let us become citizens. Much as we admire the kind of sturdy citizenship in the Nordic countries, it seems to kind of elude us, really, here. The very idea of citizenship kind of remains at arm's length, and it may be partly a post-colonial hangover. But we keep at sort of certain arm's length from, of course I'm accepting the McGill community from all of that. So while we kind of love Ireland and we love our own communities, we don't seem to care much about the state, or we don't care about it in the same way. And in the long run, how we feel about the state and our responsibility as citizens to protect and build that state determines the quality of our republic. For the most part, Irish people in their private lives are decent, civilised, they're concerned for each other, but we haven't always extended those ethical standards of our private life in a sustained and committed way into the public sphere, and into making absolutely clear that that is what we expect from our public figures in the public sphere. And that will require us to bring our personal morality to bear much more directly on our life as citizens. So until we allow ourselves really to love the state, then we are not going to have a true republic. So thank you, Yvonne. Now, I think one of the things, as the week has gone on here, and I haven't been here for the whole of the week, but I think one of the things that's sort of daunting about something like that, is that the ideas that have been mooted here for institutional and political and banking reform can be very daunting, and they can seem very technical, and it's easy to sort of think, well, I'll let that to the experts. Well, politics is actually too important to leave to politicians. So I think one of the ways that we have to engage as citizens is that there has to be, I think, a central idea that we believe in, that we promote, and that we absolutely insist on politicians holding as their central value that guides their behaviour. And I mean by politicians also public servants. And I go back, as I have always done, to Edmund Burke and to his notion of civic stewardship as a good starting point to sustain coherence and to reform and revitalise not just politics, but the public service, the management of wealth, the management of institutions and organisations, governance, and indeed individual action. The idea of stewardship can actually, I think, be the coherent idea. According to Burke, that's my timer, incidentally. According to Burke, society is a contract or a partnership between the generations, with each successive generation possessing their society's laws and governance in the form of an entailed estate. It's given to us for lifetime use only. We're just renters. And the condition is that we pass it on, at least not diminished, and hopefully enhanced to the next generation. We are, Burke said, temporary possessors and life renters, and shouldn't act as if we own this and we are the entire masters. That conception of stewardship, of a precious resource, of partnership between past, present, and future generations now seems to me achingly relevant. I think of all the bad moments in the last few years, and my God, there have been many. The most desolate, surely, was the dawning realisation that it wasn't just this generation, but our children and our grandchildren who have been deprived of their legitimate legacy. It's against that very exacting notion of stewardship that those who held high office during the Celtic Tiger years are now being appropriately and harshly judged on how they squandered that estate. And it's against the same standard that future generations are going to judge us. Thank you.